Let me now invite the second speaker, my colleague, Associate Professor Assem Abu Hatab, who will speak about the impact on food security. Assem Abu Hatab is a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute and associate professor at the Department of Economics at the Swedish University of Agricultural Science. He is a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of SIDA and research fellow with the Economic Research Forum. Assem, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, food and food security. I argue that if we are to understand African societies, economies, and politics, food has to be in the center of any analysis. This is not because my research focuses on food security and food systems in African countries, but this is mainly due to the important role that food and agriculture play in the economic and social landscape of almost every African country. So in these few minutes, I will try to focus on two main points. First, why this particular event, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, threatens food security in Africa. And I will try to highlight few of the pathways through which the invasion affects food security on the continent. So I think in order to understand the current and likely impacts of the invasion of food security on Africa, it's important to highlight three important characteristics of African food supply chains, or what we call sometimes food security if we include those organizations and actors that contribute directly and indirectly to food production and consumption. So contemporary food supply chains in Africa are characterized by being increasingly globalized. There are strong interlinkages between domestic and local food supply chains and global supply chains, which actually explain how an invasion taking place thousands of miles away from Africa has transformed it from a neighborhood conflict to one with broader geopolitical dimension and wider impacts on food security in another continent. That's one. The second is the increasing interdependency between food and non-food systems. So if we look at the recent crises that have faced African countries, think of, for example, of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is not agriculture. It's not a food-related crisis. It's something that originated in the health sector, in the health system, but it has quickly again transformed into a food security crisis. So these increasing interdependencies between food and non-food systems explain the profound impacts of crises on Africa's food security. Think also of the energy, and I'm going to talk about the energy. The increasing trends in energy prices and oil prices, again, this is something in the energy sector, but it's affecting food security. So this showed these interdependencies between food systems and non-food systems in Africa. So now, in order to see why Africa is particularly vulnerable to these shocks, it's also the importance of agricultural sectors. Around a quarter of the GDP of Africa is produced from agriculture and food sectors. Agriculture employs about 50% of the population, and this goes up to 70% in some Eastern African countries. And also 80% of agricultural production is done by smallholder farmers who are very, very much vulnerable to changes in food prices and global food supply chains. So this again explains how the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February has added an additional threat or challenge to the already existing crises originated from the COVID-19 and also from climate change, natural disasters, conflict that the continent has been facing in recent years. A recent report from the World Bank estimates that the number of people living in extreme poverty worldwide is expected to increase between 75 to 90 million people this year, and at least 40 of them will be living in Africa, and the Russian invasion is one of the main factors which explain that. Now, I would like to highlight two important dimensions for this invasion, which again explains the impacts on food security that we are seeing today and that will worsen next year according to the expectations and projections of World Bank and FPA. One of them is the timing of this conflict, which actually take place where African food systems are already under strain. Especially it took place when many African countries were still struggling or trying to recover from the consequences of the pandemic that took place during the last 2 years and added more than 40 million people to the food insecure and increased those who are in food crisis in Africa by 35%. It's also the massive locust infestation which mainly affected countries in the Horn of Africa and added about 20 million people to the food insecure. In addition to that, it's also the location or the countries that are involved in this conflict, Russia and Ukraine. These countries represent one of the world's 6 breadbasket regions in the world. And also the invasion took place close to the Black Sea, which is a critical supply and transit hub for wheat and fertilizers. The two countries together are responsible for something between 12 to 15% of globally traded calories, and they together exported about 1/4 of wheat in 2019, about 1/4 of maize and barley, and they are also responsible for about 2/3 of global sunflower oil exports. Okay, so together the timing and the two parties involved explain to us why Africa is going to be impacted like any other part of the world. But there are some aspects that can be actually explained here, that when we talk about food security, this is a multi-dimensional concept, and it refers to a situation which exists when all people at all times have access to sufficient, nutritious, and also good quality food that enable them to meet their dietary needs and food preferences. I'm not going to talk about everything that was included in the article, but I will just highlight 2 dimensions of food insecurity. One of them is about the availability and the physical access to food, and the second is on the economic accessibility. On the availability side, the fact that most African countries rely heavily on international trade, most of food is imported, make them very vulnerable to changes in supply or in prices. A country like Nigeria, Africa's most populous country, it depends heavily on imports of grain. Wheat makes up a large portion of the diet, and it's only 1% of wheat consumed annually is produced domestically. The same thing for Egypt, where 85% of wheat imports come from Russia and Ukraine. And in addition to that, we have also Somalia, which imports more than 90% of wheat from Russia and Ukraine, and prices have recently risen to more than 300%. So in given that 70% of Ukraine's grains are distributed through the sea and that the ports in the Black Sea are becoming dangerous or unpassable, logistics firms are suspending their services and prices are increasing significantly in the recent months. Another layer to this is food exporting countries. Many of them, especially in the first weeks after the invasion when uncertainty were highest, they actually restricted exports of grains and agricultural commodities, which again kind of added another kind of a layer of uncertainty for many African countries in terms of their physical access to food. The president of the African Development Bank has recently mentioned that the war in Ukraine has led to a food shortage of 30 million metric tons, which is estimated to lead 30 million Africans into catastrophic levels of food security during this year. If we look here at the also another important dimension related to food availability is fertilizers. And fertilizers is actually, the production of fertilizer is related to natural gas, because natural gas is important ingredient in this industry. What we can see from the fertilizer price index that it has now increased to 237%, which is almost double its level if we look a year ago. If farmers in Africa are unable to afford the prices, or if they cut use, this is going to reduce the availability of food produced domestically, and of course this can have more impacts on those who are already depending on food supply chains. There are two other concerns here when it comes to fertilizers. The first is that the significant increase in oil and gas prices may lead to contracting effects on the long run. On the one hand, it may shift investments into the extractive industries and fossil fuel-based energy generation, and this will run the risk of reversing the trends towards decarbonizing, which are documented in the past 5 to 10 years. On the other hand, and this can be a big risk here, is that higher oil prices may motivate countries which produce food commodities to convert agricultural commodities into biofuels. And if we look at recent data, we can see that the production of biofuel has been increasing at 7% annually during the last decade. When oil prices go up, this motivates farmers and countries producing food to convert, because this is more profitable than just producing food commodities. So the last point here is about accessibility, the purchasing power of African people being able to buy food commodities. On average, Africans spend between 30% to 55% on food. This can be like 45% of household expenditure in Egypt, 54% of household expenditure in Nigeria is spent on food. So households are very sensitive to changes on food prices. When we see higher food prices, now they are actually in many countries are 35% above their rates in the previous years. This will have enduring effects on headline inflation through the inflationary expectations and workers' demands for higher wages. And again, this can have create a vicious circle where food prices lead to higher inflation lead to higher food prices, and so on and so forth. This, of course, if we look at the global inflation today, it's estimated at 5.2%. And this has forced many central banks in Africa to increase interest rates and led to higher debt servicing costs in Africa. And according to a recent report, the Financing for Sustainable Development report, 60% of low-income countries are already at high risk or in debt distress. In Africa today, 16% of export earnings, and in some low and least income countries, more than 30% of their export earnings is used just for debt servicing. So the situation is complex, both in terms of physical access to food and the economic accessibility to food commodities. In the article which we included in this issue, I also refer to social unrest as a consequence of higher food prices and lack of access to food commodities. I'm not going much into this, but I would like to conclude here with the following. African food supply chains are increasingly globalized. They are interdependent with other sectors, which means that it's unlikely that interventions that focus on the food system or the food supply chain in isolation from other systems, from the energy system, from the health system, from the geopolitics, will be able to provide and ensure that people will have access or sustainable access to food commodities. We need holistic approaches. We need to invest more on food. We need to ensure that African countries have better bilateral trade relationships. And I think I can leave this to the discussion, Therese. Thank you so much.